So I'm finding myself here between psychology and moral theology, and very logically so, because I'm kind of in between, or I'm uniting those two points of view. And as Dr. Witz was talking from the point of psychology, and we are moving towards discussion of Humani Vitae with Father George Woodall in the next talk. I think this is kind of a bridge. I hope you'll find it kind of a bridge, my talk. About the ancient meaning of sex. Okay. That's the topic. So, Europe rediscovers ancient meaning of sex, read the headline of the International New York Times edition on the 9th of April 2015, exactly 1 year ago, very providential. The article stated that recently a group called Sex and Society, the main provider of sex education in Denmark, started teaching not only how to prevent pregnancy, but also how to achieve it. It's demographic winter which is ringing alarm bells for Europe's politicians and elsewhere. In Japan, the article says, sadly, the sales of adult diapers currently begin to eclipse those of baby diapers. So, as is usual for senile amnesia, Europe's memory becomes directed to her younger, ancient days. Could we have a slide here about that? When, having been ravished and seduced by Zeus, she bore him 3 sons on the island of Crete. Oh, this forgotten time. Okay. There is a certain answer to the meaning of sex in this painting of French Baroque artist Jean-François de Troilly. I ask you to think about it. What's the clue there, which is kind of completely omitted in our times of sex? The New York Times journalist, in contrast to the title of my speech, wrote about this ancient meaning of sex without putting the word ancient into quotes. It sounds serious. Really, the modern meaning of sex is sex, not procreation. Besides other things, so to say, one can also conceive a child in sex. This was forgotten, and the time comes to remember this possibility. The amnesia is universal. Sex to be a sort of antidepressant and a tranquilizer, if I may use those terms, to use for every occasion, even when a moment calls for a certain moderation. To give just one out of abundant examples, in the midst of broadcasting on terrorist attacks in Brussels, the Italian television news channel was advertising bed mattresses with a beautiful lady lying on it, bed mattress, seductively persuading of its advantages. Images of scarcely clad women appear on newspaper websites just below the latest news, promising to enlighten you on the 10 newest secrets of sex, or how to get sexual ecstasy in spite of loss of passion or something else. The girls portrayed in the images of those invaluable messages are young and beautiful. The contraceptive mentality of our time calls them sexually attractive. But what is this sexual attraction? What girl is considered beautiful in men's eyes? Research indicates that across different cultures, I'm referring to Buss's book, which Dr. Witz mentioned also, evolutionary psychologist. Men are looking for wives between 20 and 40 years old, 2.5 years younger on average than themselves, and are fascinated by the classical features of feminine appearance. The hourglass figure shape, clear skin, bright eyes, shiny hair. Now in medicine, these features are called secondary sexual characteristics. They are mostly the result of activity of estrogen, an hormone whose first function is the maturation of the egg in the ovary. It is in the fertile days of the menstrual cycle, exactly when estrogen reaches highest levels, that the girl is most beautiful. This is confirmed by studies whereby men are found to judge that most beautiful faces of girls are those whose photos were taken during the peak fertility, although they didn't know this fact nor they were told about the aim of the study. At the peak concentrations of estrogen in their cycle, girls' minds become sharper. There is a 25% growth of connection in the hippocampus, the brain's memory center. They are more agile, more communicative, and more longing for love. If one remembers that all this happens at the time when the flow of estrogen brings the egg to maturation, so that it is ready to be fertilized, it is not difficult to make a conclusion that all these beautiful features mentioned above are strong visual markers of fertility. The girl is a gatekeeper of life. So, what was lost in our culture is the baby. Here, and you see the baby is dragging this bull, which is Zeus. And you have many, many other paintings of romantic kind, sentimental kind of paintings of romantic love, where you have a cherub shooting an arrow into the hearts of the lovers, and this cherub is always a baby. This was kept in mind. The love was somehow seen always in the context of new life. So this seems to be forgotten. And partly there is some interesting things to think about the history of science here, because when you speak about fertility, hormones and egg and cells and sperm and such things, biological processes, we sometimes find ourselves in thinking, at least the students studying at school, they often think, well, this is kind of science, dry and so on, but then the love area, the attraction between the sexes, or the images they get in their mobile phones, those things are much more attractive, much more powerful than just what we know about fertility, about science and so on. So there is this problem in the history of science, which we wouldn't have time to examine very deeply here, but Christopher Dawson, an English historian, writes about this problem in his book, The Crisis of Western Education. And the main thesis is that the scientific understanding is in danger of losing the dimension of beauty of the world, of which also Wilhelm Goethe was very much concerned in his attempts to humanize science. So, in other words, the girl is a gatekeeper to the mystery of life. No. It's not only just fertile. She's the solution of the mystery of life and death. No? It's because the fertility is a mystery. The life is a mystery, and we are also finding ourselves here in the area of thinking about the blessing and also original sin. So the girl is very beautiful. She's deadly beautiful. She's drop-dead gorgeous, as it is said in the United States. And so for a young man, he's either going to have life or he'll be dead if he's rejected. No. This is very deep. We can't go too much into that. And of course, and we have these dramas in Dostoevsky type of writers about love, hate, and heaven, hell, dimensions of love, and we know that there is a lot of destruction related to sexuality or to utilitarian side of sexual power or fertility power, and that's rooted in original sin. And then, of course, the holiness of marriage is the only thing which can save this man from being killed by the beauty of the girl. Okay, so that's a brief excursion to the side. Let's go back to our text here about this sexual attractiveness, which is based on the readiness and the longing for a new life. Well, that's what it is about. Could we have a ITL logo here? Because in the the Western painting is weak compared to the Eastern. You see there in the chapel. I think we have to be much more modest. So, all right. So this guy, when he sees a very beautiful girl, he basically, even without knowing it, he's longing to have a baby with her. Well, that's the logic of his body, of his psyche, you could say. Unconscious. But here a question arises. All right, considered from a physiological point of view, so you forget this is the mystery of life, it's physiology, so the history of science plays into that. The connection between girls' beauty, sexual attractiveness, and fertility is clear. But will the new life satisfy her desire for her life? Life full of excitement, pleasure, adventure, and perhaps the prestige of a career woman? Maybe just on the contrary, the new baby will take away from her these wonderful things. Or, as a man is fascinated with feminine beauty in her fertile days, will this desire of his body, in quotes, to produce an offspring satisfy his yearning for the success in his life? These hesitations sound very natural for our time. However, they are quite new if viewed from the point of history. As writes Gabriel Marcel, sometimes called Catholic existentialist, one of the most famous Catholic philosophers of the 20th century, as he writes in his essay on creative vow as essence of fatherhood. This question, why and under what circumstances can a man wish to have children? This question has not arisen in former times, and consequently it did not need an answer. That's a quote now, man's inner attitude towards life, that is to say both toward the life which he has received and toward the life which he has to transmit, has undergone a deep change, end of quote. According to Marcel, again a quote, the question did not suggest itself to man's consciousness during periods of great vitality, any more than does the question of why he himself is in the world. End of quote. It arises only whereas in our age there is an ebbing of life's tide. Similarly to John Paul II's emphasis on adequate anthropology as a condition for genuinely moral life, Marcel thinks that anti-life attitudes, though Marcel alludes mostly to contraception, he wrote this in the 1940s in France. We could add also to the list of anti-life attitudes, of course, the problem of abortion, euthanasia, artificial reproductive technologies, and so on. So he was thinking that these anti-life attitudes represent not only a moral crisis, but a certain mental attitude towards life, mental attitude, much more a vital weakening than a transgression. Likewise, John Paul II in his Evangelium Vitae writes about the eclipse of the value of life. Of the value of life. In other words, our culture is facing a cognitive problem, you could say. And then not so much the moral one. Of course, we err out of ignorance and moral weakness, as I once heard very briefly summarized by Professor Sayward. But ignorance plays a very important role, and basically that is behind many problems in our life. In other words, our culture is facing a cognitive problem. Man has lost the transcendent character of his existence as man, writes John Paul II. He no longer considers life as a splendid gift of God, something sacred entrusted to his responsibility and thus to his loving care and veneration. End of quote, John Paul II. When this happens, when culture's blurred vision does not anymore see the brightness of the sky of life, and life becomes a thing, then, in words of John Paul II, the thing which man claims as his exclusive property, completely subject to his control and manipulation. So having lost the perception of life's grandeur, man thinks he is able to twist it in ways which are narrow-mindedly convenient, thus robbing himself of the depths, vitality and meaning which accompany his openness to being. So I think this perspective, Marcellian perspective, also perspective John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae, has a certain potential of dialogue with the culture, which is starving for the sense of being, for a sense of transcendence. And you can see it in those cheap replacements of the search for God in New Age technologies and so on. But it exists, and everybody wants this depth and experience of greatness, of life, of universe, as it's understood in atheistic framework. So I think this is something promising in my eyes, to show that, okay, well, you err mostly because of, well, you don't know. Blaise Pascal says the person isn't offended so much if you say, well, okay, well, this is, you didn't have the information. Well, this is why you do so and so. Not because you are morally weak or wrong. So very much in this sense, there's deception going on, and there's okay, well, this ancient meaning of sex was forgotten. There is an amnesia that this, the attraction between man and woman is about mystery of life, which is very rewarding, as we shall see, I hope shortly. The reasons for this mental failure and the loss of life's vigor are broad and complex, not in the least connected with the development of civilization and perhaps the history of science. Marcel sees them in man's weakened connection with the rhythm of nature, with its change of seasons, the lost dynamism between the light and darkness, where darkness, together with the depths of the starry sky, is accompanied by the consciousness of man's fragility amidst the invisible dangers surpassing the limits of the physical, and where the light and warmth of the sun is sensed as a source of life and joy, sharply and vividly. And this rich phenomenology of everyday life is, interestingly enough, destroyed by a trivial electric bulb. To what Marcel wrote in the 40s, one should perhaps add the qualities of the age of information consumption, a certain intellectual overweight, when analogously to the body weight and input is out of proportion with the output, resulting in what one could call an intellectual obesity, a certain nausea of mental overeating when we, as observed by Joseph Pieper, stop to look in order to see, but look just for the sake of looking, which seems to drain one's energy down so that the need of a stimulant as a protection against boredom arises. Now, Joseph Pieper, in the book on leisure as base of culture, writes about curiosity, which was a vice in the classical Western mind. There are things which we don't need to know, and if we go after them, basically, well, many bad results follow. The first of them being that we use our energy when we find ourselves tired after reading too much. So it seems that it is exactly this state of akchedia, produced by reading too much news, consuming too much energy out of mere curiosity, that the vendors of pornography use for seducing men into opening up a pop-up window on the computer screen in which a heavenly, in quotes, sexual happiness is awaiting. A deceitful promise to relieve this overeater from the heavy mood and sluggishness. Thus, liberation from this form of misuse of fertility power asks, besides other things, for a certain mental diet or hygiene, where one is called to give something, to act after having received, perhaps to close the screen and pray about the victim of an earthquake somewhere in Chile. There is an English joke about the latest news. Nothing exciting, just a small earthquake in Chile. However, this is one reason Marcel thinks we have this kind of cognitive problem in understanding the grandeur of life. Then it's not his main reason. The main reason, as Marcel says, is in the breakage of the nuptial bond with life. Let me read Marcel himself. So that's a breakage between man and life is mostly responsible for this kind of loss of understanding of grandeur of life and contraceptive attitude and so on. It seems as though it were necessary to postulate, writes Gabriel Marcel in the essay The Mystery of the Family, that's another essay, necessary to postulate the existence of a pact, I should almost say a nuptial bond between man and life. It is in man's power to untie this bond, but insofar as he denies the pact, he tends to lose the notion of his own existence. The man who dares to have confidence in life and who gives himself to life in procreation receives a response of life to this confidence of man, end of quote. Yes, openness to the child seems to be the openness to life from a capital letter, a life far greater than the lifestyle, the pursuit of which can be the reason of practicing contraception. As man puts himself at the service of life, he becomes a creative agent, actively contributing to the universal succession of generations. A work, writes Marcel, which is accomplishing itself in our world and far beyond it. In this connection, the condition of the human being is not essentially different from that of the artist, who is the bearer of some message which he must communicate, of some flame which he must kindle and pass on, like the torchbearers of Lucretius. End of quote. This openness to the breadth and grandeur of the transmission of life through ages of human history also gives a special touch to what is called, somewhat misleadingly, because of the insufficient linguistic meaning of the word sexual act. There is a sense of grandeur, if the word holiness is too foreign to the contemporary air because of its moral, in quotes, implications, to the openness of the flesh, to the operation of the flesh, says Gabriel Marcel, which ought to be hallowing of a certain inward fulfillment and outflowing not to be forced, since it springs from an experience of plenitude, end of quote. Meanwhile, this grandeur is lost, beginning of quote, if it is not an act of thanksgiving, a creative testimony, end of quote. So I think, again, we have here another possibility of dialogue with the culture, which is, in a way, you would say, obsessed with the cult of pleasure and sex and so on. And, well, this obsession, their obsession, seems to be born exactly out of the frustration of life, out of this existential frustration in the conjugal act, because if you frustrate this openness to life, well, you are going to be strangled by the demon of lust, as I think the classical story we know is from the book of Tobit. The 7 corpses of bridegrooms were dragged out of Sarah's chambers after the first night of marriage, in the book of Tobit. I know. And then Tobit, Tobias, is it right? Tobias prayed, said, well, I take this sister of mine not out of lust, but of love for children. And then angel, that was Raphael, caught the demon, Asmodeus, and put him somewhere in the Egyptian desert, and Tobias was saved because he was not strangled by the demon of lust. Okay. And we know that the lust can lead one in the, well, first of all, to various forms, increasingly abundant forms of sexual gratification, and then it's connected with violence and so on. That's the logic of pornography. So it seems that, yeah, when this existential depths of conjugal love is lost, and understanding of sexuality is lost, you have problems. I always joke that the demon, since those glorious times, escaped the Egyptian desert and now is residing part-time in Brussels and part-time in New York. So. United Nations headquarters, as we know, their strategies.
In the past, he was partly in Vienna.
All right. How much time do we have? Sigmund? 5? Okay, fine. Thank you. So, there seems to exist a peculiar interplay between the fidelity to one's nature, or being one's authentic self, and a certain elevation of human existence to the noble breadths of the spiritual above the material dimension of life. So on the one hand, Marcel justly asks a bored individual, the one who decided to put oneself outside the stream of life for the sake of convenience and in need of stimulants, to regain at least a certain vigor of life. At the origin of diversion, of the will to be diverted or amused at any price, there is an attempt to escape, but from what, asks Marcel. And he answers, it can be only from oneself. The ego is without any doubt faced with a dilemma, to fulfill itself or to escape, end of quote. Where it does not attain fulfillment, it is only conscious of itself as of an unendurable, gaping void from which it must seek protection at any price. As we have seen above, the nature of attraction between man and woman is not sexual, but generative. Man's whole being longs for the unity with the opposite sex because of the desire of a still greater unity in the fulfillment of the very logic and reason of the sect, the new life, the child. That the non-verbal logic of the body in the act of love is unequivocally directed to the fruit of that love is eloquently pointed out not only in the phenomenological subtleness of John Paul II's thinking, but also in the analysis of sexual act carried out by one of the most famous psychoanalysts, 20th century, Erik Erikson. Thereby, if we keep in mind that one's masculinity or femininity reaches down to the very core of one's personal identity, and that this masculinity and femininity is conditioned by a man's ability to beget and the woman's to conceive, repudiation of this dimension of one's self is in contraceptive perception of the other sex, and contraceptive practices go against the very core of oneself. Boredom and emptiness is the fruit of chosen barrenness. Marcel was saying it already in the 1940s. when he said that the whole France is sick with a metaphysical malady, that is boredom. Furthermore, the identity-defining character of one's generative or fertile masculinity or femininity is revealed in Marcel's connecting it with the notion of vocation. So in pondering upon man's deliberation to have children or not, a new question, as we saw this above, Marcel observes that the question why has a certain character of senselessness compared to that which is felt when somebody asks an artist who is following his vocation, why do you do that? It has no practical sense, or it does not produce substantial amounts of money, does not make you popular or something. The more totality of an action involves the personality of the agent, the more it is of the nature of vocation, and the less the question under consideration can be asked without absurdity, says Marcel. This line of thought echoes the Aristotelian distinction between two types of action, transitive and immanent. While the object of transitive activity is outside the subject, this is what we make, the effects of immanent acts remain within the subject and are done for their own sake. This is what we are doing, like living, thinking, or loving. The immanent activity is ranked higher than the transitive activity by Aristotle because its aim is the very fulfillment of or perfection of the agent. So if procreation is immanent activity, it brings fulfillment of self. So then but what is this fulfillment of oneself? We are again in dialogue with humanistic psychology, the language of realization of self, the Abraham Maslow language. The language of humanistic psychology permeated the culture, the Western culture. Advertisement uses slogans, be yourself, be free, and such things. It's very influential. So how do we prove is there any evidence of fulfillment of self, which is being true to your bodily nature, is more fulfilling than kind of types of self-realization advertised by humanistic psychology? While thinking along the lines of classical tradition of Aristotle, we are taking a different perspective than the highly influential humanistic psychology, which is related to, which is sometimes called a cult of self-worship, as Professor Witz has a book, Psychology of as a cult of self-worship, and part of the book is dealing with exactly with humanistic psychology. For Aristotle, it is a virtuous activity which is properly human and therefore fulfilling. Exercising his objectively phenomenological thinking, way of thinking, Karl Wojtyla wrote in 1978 essay that Humane Vitae deepened the personalist understanding of human being. It was not only kind of instructional morality, deepened the understanding of human person. What is it? That is to say that being in touch with one's generative of power, of fertility power, enriches the subjective experience of self with colors which turn gray when the connection between one's masculinity or femininity and life is abdicated. There's a richness there, and as we know from ladies who stop using contraception and start using natural family planning, they feel this richness of life. They are in harmony with cosmic rhythm, if you want, and yes, emotions and perception, longings are different in different parts of the cycle, as was discussed today already. It's a richness of life. Isn't this challenging creative view of one's personhood and self-realization, to borrow another term from humanistic psychology, more attractive than, so to say, the eternal vacation on the beach mentality with its limitless amounts of sensual gratification? So Gabriel Marcel, in speaking about accepting the challenge of fatherhood, says that in doing this, man places himself at the axis of his destiny and adopts a position in which he can face one of the essential tests he has to satisfy in order to be master of his own life. Isn't the man who dares to be generous in exercising his bodily masculinity while accepting the challenge to raise children happy, good, and strong persons? Isn't he hearing clearly in his soul that in doing this he's proving that he is a man from a capital letter? And in this he is rewarded with a feeling of nobility and dignity, of which he can be rightly proud of. In respecting his physical nature, he is becoming noble exactly because his nature, of which fertility is an integral part, is noble, because it has been created by the source of all nobility, it is God. And here Marcel is making a very interesting point about connection, about the kind of spiritual nature of biology, if you want. Very deep issue, perhaps. Let me deal with it shortly. That's the last paragraph. The theme of goodness of creation emerges in Marcel's thinking on the essential dimensions of personhood of parenthood as vocation. The main characteristic proper to all vocation is, quote, the presence of generosity, which is free from every possible self-interest. It is evident that, writes Marcel, to refuse to follow a vocation is in no way to emancipate or free oneself. It is exactly the opposite. End of quote. With proper safeguards against claiming the ideal of indiscriminate reproduction, Marcel points to, one would say, to an unexpected convergence, a sense of junction between the infra and the supra spheres of life. The first of these meaning the spontaneity of the biological natural processes of the subconscious life, and the other speaking about the generosity and utter disinterestedness of the acts which express a vocation or fulfill a vow. Both these activities, I quote, spread out beyond the world in which the calculable triumphs. This convergence between the spiritual and the material is realized at a point, Marcel says, which is beyond our reach. And truly it is, because it is rooted in the mystery of creation. Similarly, in Love and Responsibility, Karl Wojtyla wrote that in parenthood, a meeting between two orders takes place, namely the order of nature or biology and the personalistic order. In parenthood, as also eloquently shown by Fulton Sheen, man transcends a natural egocentricity of the eros, while purifying and merging it with agape, a love the qualities of which, given the openness of the spouses to sacramental grace, go beyond what is human. But this is hardly surprising. A man who incarnates the logic of his biology, in quotes, becomes greater than he is because he is implementing the logic of the creator of this biology. And thus he undergoes a theosis. The longing for life, which is this ancient, in quotes, and forgotten meaning of sex, if understood and taken for what it is, fills one with the life. Thank you for your attention.